Good afternoon. Welcome to a special webinar of Feeling Knowledge Project. My name is Laura Scivetti. I work in the project team. And today the webinar is a special event because we have the honor to host the international expert, Professor Dominick Salvatore. Dominick Salvatore is a distinguished professor of economics and the director of the Ph.D. program in economics at Fordham University in New York City. He is honorary professor at Shanghai Finance University, Hunan University, and University of Pretoria. He is also the past president of the North American Economic and Finance Association and the International Trade and Finance Association. He is a consultant to the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Economic Policy Institute, and several multinational corporations and global banks. He has given more than 500 lectures around the world, was awarded the Achievement Award by the University of New York, and was nominated for the 2010 National Medal of Science awarded by the President of the United States. Professor Salvatore is also the author of the world's leading textbook on international economics. His theory and problems of microeconomics has been translated into 18 languages, with more than 800,000 copies sold. In all, he has published 53 volumes. Professor, welcome to the webinar. I just remind the attendees that after the interview, a question time session is foreseen, so they can write the question in the chat box. So, Professor Salvatore, let's start from globalization. My first question is about globalization. Now we live in the age of globalization, but most people have only a vague idea of what globalization is and its importance. Please, can you explain this to us?
Thank you very much, Laura. It's a pleasure to be here. Globalization, as you said, we live in a world of globalization, but many people have only a vague idea of what is globalization. Well, globalization is a revolution, which in terms of scope and significance is comparable to the Industrial Revolution. But while the Industrial Revolution evolved over a century, the globalization revolution is occurring under our very eyes and occurring in a decade or two. Now, as a revolution, globalization is a very complex process which, to be evaluated properly, should be, it has economics, sociological aspects, legal aspects, and also health aspects, and there is also the well-being of society actually in mind. Well, to truly, as an economist, I will only look at the economic aspects of globalization, and in order to even indicate those components of globalization, we have to examine its four fundamental aspects, which are globalization in tastes, globalization in production, globalization in labor markets, and globalization in financial markets. So all of these are involved, and really to fully understand, we should examine each of those.
Okay, so you say that globalization has four major economic components. Globalization in tastes, production, labor markets, and financial markets. Please, can you elaborate on each of these four aspects of globalization?
Yes, let's begin with globalization in tastes. Now, because of the revolution in telecommunications and transportation, there is today a convergence of tastes at the global level. And firms have responded by introducing products which are more and more of a global kind, of global nature. For example, the really first true global product, it's not an important product, was the Gillette Sensor Razor, which was introduced in 1990. This was truly the first global product because it was introduced simultaneously in 19 different countries, in the 19 most important markets in the world. Now, in the past, products were first introduced in one nation, and then gradually introduced elsewhere. This was the first time that a product was introduced simultaneously everywhere in the world, as I've said, in the largest 19 markets in the world, with exactly the same television spot advertisement, except for language. But even that could have been English in today's globalized world. Well, Gillette sold in 5 years over 400 million of these razors and 7 billion cartridges, and earned, not revenue, profits, over $1 billion. So this process of globalization, or the introduction of global products, has continued by leaps and bounds. And it's not just cheap food products, such as Coca-Cola. Can you imagine? It has 40% of the U.S. market for non-alcoholic beverages and 1/3 of the world market. Now, few products are as globalized as Coca-Cola. However, this process of introducing global products is increasing by leaps and bounds, and we are moving toward what has been called a global supermarket. So the point is, because of the revolution in tastes, in telecommunications and transportation, people want more and more the same things, and firms have responded by introducing products which are more and more global in nature. The second aspect of globalization is globalization in production. Well, this has two different components. One which is more dynamic and modern, the other one is more traditional, but pushed much more forward than in the past. The more dynamic aspect of globalization in production is reflected in the tremendous increase in international trade in parts and components as opposed to final products. And one might say, well, what's the importance of this? Well, the importance is that there is practically no major product in the world which does not have many parts and components made abroad. For example, when an American citizen bought a ThinkPad, IBM ThinkPad, they thought they were buying an American product. Well, not even 1/4 of the parts and components of that laptop was made in the United States. And this outsourcing of parts and components is not a desire of the firm, but it's imposed on the firm in order to remain internationally competitive. That is, a firm must scout the world to see where each parts and components is made better and cheaper, otherwise it would lose international competitiveness. The other aspect of globalization in production is reflected in the tremendous increase in production facilities established abroad. Now, this occurred all the time. However, since the most recent, this process of globalization has extended much more rapidly. For example, Nestle, the largest food company in the world, imagine, from small Switzerland, the largest food company in the world. Without globalization, Nestle would be a small firm. Nestle has production facilities in over 59 countries. Ford, which seems the prototype of American product, has more workers abroad and production facilities abroad than in the United States. Now, if you put together these two aspects of globalization and production, that is, outsourcing of parts and components and establishing production facilities abroad, you realize that it's very difficult to decide what is the nationality of a product. For example, a Toyota produced in the United States with 55% parts and components from Japan. Is it an American product or a Japanese product? Well, in a globalized world, it doesn't make sense to talk about the nationality of a product. a global multinational is very concentrated in its nucleus, which coordinates activities all over the world in order to be close to consumers and respond to consumers' changing tastes. Someone said, if we are becoming more and more equal, why do we need to be close to the consumers if we are becoming more and more the same? Well, we are becoming more and more alike in the world. However, we will never be completely the same. And the winning corporation is the one which is able to address even the small remaining differences in tastes. So we saw globalization in tastes, globalization in production, globalization in labor markets as even more complex and more close to us as workers. Because today there is no major product produced in an advanced country that cannot be produced with the same quality and at a cheaper price in some of the most advanced emerging markets, such as China, Korea, and so on. And this has occurred only during the past 2 decades. Because now, with teleconferencing or telepresence, we can manage from abroad. Also, international competitiveness forces us to invest new technology and capital where they are more productive, and labor is much better trained today than it was 30 years ago. So for all of these reasons, the labor markets have globalized. I always tell young people in advanced countries, there is someone in a developing country, in an emerging market, who is willing to do what you are preparing to do better and cheaper. This doesn't mean that wages in advanced countries has to decline, but it means that we have to value the advantages which rich countries have in technology, in design of products, and so on, and therefore justify the higher wages. Also, we no longer are protected by costs of transportation, that is firms in advanced countries or workers in advanced countries, because the cost of transportation is declined, and from trade obstructions such as tariffs, which have become very low. So labor markets are also globalized. Finally, financial markets are globalized, and this is useful and beneficial, because then capital flows where it is most efficient, and also people can invest by minimizing costs and risks and maximizing benefits. However, because we have a globalized financial market, the danger is that a crisis in one country spreads quickly to other countries. So what we have to do is to regulate these financial markets to prevent this from occurring. So we have globalization from an economic point of view, that is the aspect of tastes, globalization in production, globalization in labor markets, and globalization in financial markets. And these are the important aspects that make globalization so important and crucial to the modern economies.
Okay. So some people, including the Nobel Prize winner George Stiglitz, say that globalization leads to increased poverty in the world. Do you agree?
Well, I don't agree at all, and it's not a question of opinion. People can have all the Nobel Prize they want, but if they are wrong, they are wrong, and the proof is in the facts. For example, all of the nations, all of the emerging markets that have globalized have grown rapidly during the past 20, 30 years. They have grown faster than the advanced countries, and they have reduced the inequalities between rich and poor. It is the countries that did not globalize that remain very poor, and they are not growing rapidly and have increasing inequalities with rich countries. So how can one accuse globalization for causing to be the cause of poverty in the world if it is the countries that did not globalize that are poor and remained poor, and the countries that did globalize became richer? No one forced China to open up. No one. But without opening, China would not have obtained the savings and investments, because China was poor before, could not save and invest much. Without opening, China could not get the foreign investments that it needed, would not be able to get the technology that it needed, and it would not have the markets that permitted China to grow so rapidly. So globalization is not the cause of poverty. What we can accuse globalization is that it did not allow all the poor countries to benefit from the process of globalization. So we have to intervene to change this process, to moderate it, to regulate it, so as to allow also the poor nation to benefit. But globalization is not per se the cause. It only prevented the poorest nations, did not allow the poor nations to also participate and benefit from globalization. So I really think Stiglitz and all the people who believe that are wrong.
Okay, so how much has world poverty changed during the most recent period of globalization? I mean, where did it decline the most? Has it increased in some areas?
Well, I mean, we have data. This is not my data. People should know the facts. In 1980, 1.9 billion people were defined as living in poverty. That meant they had less than $1.25 that they could spend each day per person. That was in 1980. 1.9 billion people, which were 52% of the population of the poor countries. In 2012 or 2010, the data does not go to 2012, we have 1.3 billion people that are poor. So there has been a decline of 600 million people from poverty, out of poverty, during the period of globalization, in this period of globalization. So that the poor, since population grew and the number of poor people declined, the percentage of the poor of the people living in developing countries that were poor declined from 52% to 22%. So 1980, 1.9 million people were poor. That was 52% of the population of developing countries. Today it is 1.3 billion, 600 million less, and it's 22% of the population of poor nations, which during this period has increased. It is true that most of the decline in poverty occurred in China, but that's where most of the poor people were. So China had 850 million people almost in 1980. Today has 150 million people who moved out of poverty. But there is one major area where poverty has increased, and this is in sub-Saharan Africa. It went from 200 million in 1980 to almost double, 368 million in 2010. However, since the population of sub-Saharan Africa increased during this period, it was 50% of sub-Saharan Africa lived in poverty in 1980, and today it's 47%. The number has increased, but because population also has increased, the percentage remains about the same. This is the major area where poverty in the world has increased. But even if we look at the United Nations, the Millennium Goals, the Millennium Goals is to eliminate poverty and hunger by the year 2015. Well, the Millennium were established in 1990, and between 1990 and 2010, 75 to 80% of that goal has been achieved. So we have 3 years to go to 2015, and it seems we are on target for eliminating poverty, that is, sheer poverty and hunger. Of course, eliminating poverty means that no one will live at below $1.25 per person per day. But that would still leave, people are still very poor, but not the poorest as defined by the World Bank.
Okay, so Professor, if globalization is not the cause of poverty in the world. What is?
Well, as I said before, globalization can only be accused of not having allowed the poorest country to participate in and benefit from globalization. The primary cause of poverty in poor countries today, we know, and it's clear. It is strife, that is internal discord, such as civil wars. It is crime. It is corruption. It is natural disasters. Please understand, I mean, no country has a monopoly on crime. No country has a monopoly on corruption. But when you are very poor, and corruption and crime is much more damaging to development and to growth. So the primary cause then of poverty in poor countries is civil wars, political instability, crime, corruption, natural disasters, diseases such as HIV. All of these things are the primary causes and need to be eliminated, and globalization can help in the elimination of these and allowing even the poorest country to participate. But it is not the primary cause of poverty in the world. When a poor country exports to a rich country and receives a low price for its products, that is bad. But the alternative was no export at all and no benefit. So we certainly have to change so that poor countries get a fair price for the goods that they export. But without the globalization, they would have nothing to export and would be even poorer.
So, what can the rich countries of the world do to reduce poverty and hunger in the world and increase food security?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are several things that rich countries could do and could have done and have not done enough. Some are very clear and easy to do. It only needs people to have the willingness to do it. First, they could cancel all of the foreign loans. In other words, not cancel the loans, but the repayments. So all of the loans that they gave to developing countries, those countries cannot repay them. And it would be really a good deed to eliminate the repayments. Cancel the need to repay. Secondly, it could give a bit more foreign aid. I mean, today, rich nations give 1/5 of 1% of their GDP in the form of aid, foreign aid. Now, the United Nations has been saying for decades to increase that 3/4 to 3/4 of 1% or 1%. But rich nations have not done so. So it's not a great sacrifice to give up 1% of GDP to the poorest country to overcome. I mean, there are 20,000 babies dying of hunger each day. And in my country, the United States, 40% of the population is obese. So they would do good for them and help to prevent hunger in other countries by giving more. And so to cancel the repayments of loans, they cannot repay it anyway. To increase foreign aid to even 1%, it would be 4 times more than they give now. And they can go a long way towards overcoming famine and hunger in the world. Thirdly, and very important, to allow the poor countries to export their products to rich countries, eliminate without the restrictions and the tariffs. I mean, sometimes a poor country with great sacrifice can develop a textile industry, say. And now when they go to export to rich nations, they are limited in how much they can export. Rich countries say if we allow them to export textiles, it takes away jobs from us and we are already in a recession. But rich countries can do much, labor can be used to do other things. Developing countries, those are the goods in which they have a comparative advantage, which they can produce cheaper and better. And so it would be wonderful to allow them to export those goods. After all, we know the saying. You know, you give me a fish, I eat for a day. You teach me to fish and I can eat for a lifetime. So those are certainly the things. And to come more to food security, well, many people say we have to increase production. We have to increase productivity. Yes, we should do that. But inevitably, you have natural disasters, droughts, which then lead to shortages and increase in prices. So no matter how much we produce, of course it would be better. But one way, which is not easy, is to create a buffer stock. That is, when we have overproduction, then save some of that production for times when inevitably we have droughts and we have shortages. Then another way that food security is hampered is when the price of basic foods increases very much. Well, one could establish through the World Bank, a fund to subsidize the purchase. In other words, if the price of basic food increases by 50% all of a sudden, it would be very nice and easy. All it takes is resources to say, well, we will subsidize or will pay for the increase in price. All of these things, of course, require a desire and a willingness to do it and the sacrifice of resources, but can be done with not a huge sacrifice, because, as I said, if the rich countries gave 1%, one could do most of these things.
Okay, my last question, because we are receiving many questions from attendees, though I would like to give them space. So, what general conclusion can we reach on the relationship between globalization and poverty in the world?
Well, one could say, number one, that globalization is important because it increases efficiency. Okay? Number two, that we cannot hide. If we close up, we will not grow and we will not develop. Globalization is not the cause of poverty. However, it can be blamed for not allowing all the countries, especially the poorest country, to participate and receive the benefits of globalization. Therefore, world governance should be changed to give the poorest country a voice in the determination of how the economic and financial system works. We used to have the G7 countries, that is the United States, Japan, Germany, France, England, Italy, and Canada. And they were accused of directing world trade and finance for their benefit to the detriment and the harm of developing countries. Now we went to the G20, which includes 12 of the largest and most dynamic emerging markets. So they now have a voice. So we have 7 G7, 12 emerging markets, and 1, the European Union as a whole. So we get 20. Now the question is, will these G20 look only upon their interests, and therefore will be as guilty as the G7, or will they, because they are developing, will look at the effect of globalization and to improve the governance of the world economy, taking into consideration the developing nations which are not members of the G20. Otherwise, we will go from one club of the rich to one club of the powerful, and the poor people are forgotten. So we really hope, and again, one way would be to provide even more directly a voice in the governance in the United Nations, in the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. They now have a voice, but they have a voice in proportion to their economy. The economy of poor countries is very small, so they don't count much. But we hope that the G20, through the emerging markets, which are members of the G20, will look at the interest of the poorest country also, and not only at their interest.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Now the question time is open, and Professor Salvatore can answer all your questions. I hope all your questions, because I know that you have a lecture in 20 minutes, so we will try. Okay, the first question is from Abdalmodi Obeidat, I'm sorry for my pronunciation, and it is, what about the global market and small farmers?
Well, this is small farmers, you see, at one point, the buyers from rich countries would go in the countryside of a small agricultural country and dictate the price of the goods they bought. For example, the chocolate makers in Switzerland, in Belgium, went to Ghana and gave farmers whatever price they want. The farmer had no bargaining power, no bargaining strength. Well, there is a way of overcoming that by forming marketing boards. Now, the marketing boards means the small farmer sells to its government agency of Ghana, for example, and then Ghana, this marketing agency, being a big seller, almost an oligopolist or monopolist, can then negotiate higher prices for the products of poor countries. And this indeed was established. But the problem then is that the extra money earned through those exports very often disappeared by people who directed these marketing boards, the relatives, the government, instead of going to the benefit of farmers. But the fault is not of the marketing board, it's the way it was organized. So it is true, small farmers often receive too low prices, but through organizing into marketing boards, they can negotiate higher prices. Look, for example, I love chocolates, and the best cocoa comes from Ghana. Now, from a chocolate that costs €5, the Ghan agricultural, the farmers get not even 10% of that price of that chocolate. Everything is in the manufacturing, into the advertising, into the selling. Now, there is no reason why Ghana could not produce the chocolate itself or not receive an adequate price for the chocolates. I mean, without Ghana's cocoa, you would not have high-quality chocolates. So, you see, it's true. And again, through governance, through changes in the way the world economy operates, one can overcome this problem. And they had already started to do so, but they did not do it well. And so the poor farmers, the small farmers still gets too low a price for that. Another case is the best cotton in the world comes from Egypt. To have a high-quality shirt must be long stem cotton. And what do the rich countries do? They impose no tariff on the exportation, the Egyptian exports of raw cotton. Then they put a tariff on the exportation of the cloth and a higher tariff in the exportation of the shirt. That discourages Egypt to industrialize by producing cloth and shirts. Egyptian tailors could be better than tailors in advanced countries, but the system is against them. So this is another way that one could change. That is, remove all of the restrictions. In fact, I would put an export tax on the long stem cotton by Egypt, and then allow the cloth and the shirt being exported without a tariff. So there are specific ways that can help, and they've not been done to some extent because the developing countries did not know how to do it, and because the rich countries did it not in an open way and were unwilling to do it. But now we can expose these irregularities or unfair forms of economic behavior to the benefit of the poor country.
Okay, the second question is from Khaled Sassi. He asks, what is the relationship between the international competitiveness of markets and globalization, and how can we measure their impact on the poverty?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the connection is as follows. The more globalized the economy, the more internationally competitive the economy is. And the more internationally competitive the nation is, the faster it grows. So there are indices of the degree of competitiveness. Then I have done studies, which I published, showing that the more competitive, the more globalized the economy, the more international. The more globalized the economy, the more internationally competitive it is. The more internationally competitive it is, the faster it grows. So that's the connection. And of course, a poor country, if it were able and capable of globalizing, it would grow faster. And when you grow faster, everybody benefits. Now, there is other theories which I will present. Today is Thursday. I'm going to Istanbul for another international conference on the 7th of May, and then on the 10th of May with the FAO, Now, there is a theory which has been proved that in the course of economic development, inequalities, internal inequalities, first increase and then gradually decline. That's part of the market. So now we know this, so we can in other words, we are growing faster, but internal inequalities increase. And so what we have to do is intervene to prevent that increase in internal inequalities in order. Now, look, for example, where are internal inequalities greatest? In advanced countries or in developing countries? It is much more in developing countries. You measure inequality by the Gini coefficient, which goes from 0 to 100. 0, it means everybody has the same income. 100, it means that one person has all the income of the country. Well, the Gini coefficient for Europe is about 0.3, 0.35. In the United States, it's 0.4. But in Brazil, in South Africa, in China, it is 0.6, 0.7. So internal inequalities. So now you globalize and you help the poorest country to globalize in order to increase international competitiveness. That will lead to a more rapid growth in the country. But that will increase naturally internal inequalities. And so you have to intervene in order to spread more evenly in the country, in the poor country, the benefits of globalization.
Okay. So there is another question from Gaetano, who asked, dear professor, in some FAO reports, I read that price rise could represent an opportunity for small, poor rural communities. How this can be possible?
Well, it's possible. Look, if you produce a good, an agricultural product, that the price increases, you are the producer. You get a higher price. So that's your benefit. It is those who consume that product and have no alternatives, like a basic food, that now face a decrease in food security. So if you happen to produce a product which is, we're not talking food, but look at the price of petroleum products. Do you know that what is the cost of extracting one barrel of petroleum in Saudi Arabia? $3 to $4. Which means that now that the price is near $100 per barrel, you saw the benefit. Now, if you produce a good that people want very much, and you have an increase in price, then you benefit. It is those who have to buy the product that are harmed by the increase in price. So even developing countries would do well to look which products that they can produce are subject to increase in prices so that they receive a benefit from producing those, and shifting away from products which face fluctuating and declining prices.
Okay, another question from Pani Zuruli. He asked, in Bangladesh, workers get 38 euros per month for their hard work to produce goods that are sold in the US or European Union. What is the responsibility of the richer countries to reverse this unfair human slavery?
Well, let's look at it both ways. If the wage was not low, they would not go there to produce. Then they would produce nothing. So now the wage is too low, unfairly low. And so this is where the globalization, notice, why couldn't Bangladesh produce the entire textile and the entire clothing? So now they rely on the production of the cloth or the good to be exported to the United States much cheaper. That also harms American workers, because now they lose their job or they have to lower their wages in order to compete. But there ought to be a way. There ought to be a way when these... So, if Bangladesh gains to the extent that it gains some employment, without those jobs, they would have not even those jobs and that low wages. But the wages are too low. Now the question is, how can we do it? Labor unions should be organizing to increase wages. Wages should be reflecting the productivity. Now, in Bangladesh, productivity is low, but wages are much lower than justified by productivity. So one would have to go through reforming the system to say these wages are low because productivity is low, but they are much lower than productivity justifies. And we have some studies that indicate that the labor productivity in Bangladesh is at least 2 or 3 times higher. In other words, the wages, if wages were 2 or 3 times higher, would still justify producing those things in Bangladesh. And the question is, how do you do this? Well, rich countries have no interest in doing this. Poor countries do not have much power to change things, and that's why we have to have more governance, empower people, empower the poor country. How? Bangladesh should have more voice to in the World Bank, in the United Nations, and in the World Trade Organization to say, it's like negotiating. Why are those wages low? Because the rich country has more bargaining power. They give you what they want, okay? And instead, so it's not easy, but it all goes back to how the world economy is managed. Governance, to empower, to have the right to have your economic rights valued, and not allow only You see, very often you have a multinational, which is bigger than the country. Imagine, do you know Walmart? Walmart has 2 million workers in the world. And there was one company in Italy producing glasses. And Walmart, when this company, Luxottica, sold to the United States, they had to deal with Walmart because it was the biggest buyer. And Walmart told Luxottica, they said they give it whatever price they wanted. So Luxottica made innovations, and the benefit went to Walmart. So what did Luxottica do? Bought the chain of distribution in the United States. Of course, Bangladesh cannot, but they can. In other words, there are ways. At this point, it is only the corporation that decides the wages, and they pay the lowest wage that they can get away with. And how does the poor country deal with a major global firm? Well, it is through negotiations, through the World Trade Organization, in other words, how? Why do the advanced countries put a tariff on the exportation from Bangladesh of cloth, of clothing? So they force Bangladesh to export the semi-processed product because of the restrictions. Advanced countries have restrictions on how much the exports of textiles from Bangladesh and other poor countries can grow each year. And that could be negotiated. So again, it's not easy, but it's a question more of economic power and bargaining. And since the country is small and the unions are weak, the only way to overcome this is to do it at a higher level, at the government level, at the United Nations, World Trade Organization, the World Bank. But of course, big countries don't want to give up their power. That's where the negotiations have to come. And I hope that the G20 will move in that direction and not care only about their interests and forget the poorest countries in the world.
Okay, last question, because I know that you have to go. Okay, but of course, for the other question, I would like to inform the attendees that they can find the answer on our Facebook and Twitter official pages, because of course we will forward this question to you. So last question is from Francesco Bottalico, and he asks how globalization can work.
Well, it's like the market. In other words, you let the market work and then intervene to give it a more human face, an ethical face. Now, there is, you see, there are two extremes. There is the capitalist system and there is the more communist system. They are both bad. The communist system collapsed because the economy collapsed. And you know the proof of this? You don't have to take my word for it. When the Berlin Wall came down, Russia, not the Soviet Union, Russia, a country of 148 million people, produce less than the Netherlands, a country of 14 million people. That meant that the standard of living of Russia was less than one-tenth of that of the Netherlands. And why was it so? Because the market was not allowed to work. Americans think Castro is a criminal. Castro is not a criminal. He's a good man who wanted good for Cuba. But good intentions without the knowledge have very bad effects. And the proof, Cuba is poorer today than 50 years ago. Okay? And 50 years ago, it was the richest country in the Caribbean. Today, it's the poorest, except for Haiti. So that system of non-market cannot work and causes economic collapse. There is no closed economy, no that is rich. Okay? Now, on the other hand, those people from that system say, well, capitalism is bad because capitalism leads to exploitation, leads to discrimination, leads to collapses. And we agree with that. We do not want the Wild West. What we want is a market economy well regulated. So the same as globalization. You cannot have globalization. No globalization is like the non-market economy. You collapse, you poor. To have globalization without any rules, it's like having a capitalist system without the Wild West. So what we need is the globalization. Allow globalization to be, because it's not the cause, but regulate it, as I said, to give it a more human face, to look at more ethical aspects. And one way to do this is not to beg the rich countries to share the benefits, but to have, through negotiations, more voice into the process. And so, as I said, to increase foreign aid, to eliminate the repayment of loans, to allow exports to be exported without restrictions, and so on. So there are many, many ways that it's difficult to explain in but I'm sure you have the idea what I mean.
Okay. Professor, thank you very much for this very interesting interview, for your availability. And before closing, I would like to remind all attendees that these topics will be developed even in next webinars that will be held on May 14. And the title of the webinar will be Food Rush, New Commercial Order, Relation, and New Concept of Poverty with Professor Felice Dinolfi. And of course, I hope to see all of you on May 14 for attending this interesting webinar. And Professor, thank you again for your availability. A special thanks to my colleague of METID Polytechnic of Milan for the fundamental support. And thank you all attendees for attending this event and for being so active with your questions. See you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.